Um, yeah, so thanks so much. Really thrilled to be here. And my son is here too, to learn from the wise farmers in this room. So many people hope that digital technologies will change the way food is produced. And then when used at scale, the entire food system, right? Making it more efficient, this is the promise, and more sustainable. So these are technologies I've pulled from John Deere's smart farming website, like sensing machinery. Some of you may use this machinery. Remote sensing, large amounts of data, and then computer programs or algorithms, we could even call it AI, that are used to mine these data, that are fed data for information or insights. So I'm probably not telling you anything new in this room, but I wanted to begin this way because I wanted to start by saying that I don't immediately dismiss the promise or potential in these tools, but I think it's precisely because farm data hold value that we need to ask for whom. What is being done with data collected off of farms, including on farmers, the laborers, and who controls these data and the algorithms that are written to use these data. And we need to think of the ways that value, not just economic, but other kinds of value are created from this data. And these are really questions about power. So I think this is why Kathy invited me to the Confronting Power panel. They're questions, obviously, that relate to the theme of this panel, but then centrally to what I do as a sociologist currently. So I'm interested in power. And I have a recent book which explores the uses, power and the uses of farm data. And I started out for the book project. Actually, I spoke with Kathy on the phone and I told her, I think I'm going to write a book on this. And I was connecting with Darren. I don't know where Darren is in the room. Hi. I also haven't seen Darren for 23 years in person. But in 2017, and back in 2017, I thought, I think I'm going to try to figure out, inspired by some of the work that Darren had done with Jim at ETC Group and some of the work that NFU had done, I wanted to try to figure out, to try to trace the data, right? What happens to it when it makes its way off the farm? Who's using it? And really get at some of those questions of power. But one of the things I found out after I revisited the book idea in 2018, after a year off because I had a baby, was that it's really difficult to do that. And that's because the data sets that are collected, especially using commercial tools, and that are sent to cloud-based infrastructure but housed in corporate data centers, and so the data sets, but also the algorithms, right? The decisions that are the backbone of the decision support tools, but even people. So even scientists, many of them working in the private sector, are all kind of obfuscated, I would call it, or hidden from critical oversight because they're protected. Protected is an interesting word, but that's what legal folks would say. Protected by a series of legal instruments, like trade secrecy law, copyright law, and intellectual property law. So all this to say, a kind of finding when we're talking about power and farm data, a first order finding is it's really hard to figure out questions of power because it's hard to access. Right? And this isn't even actually a power issue, but in my mind, it's also a validity issue. Right? How can we know if the algorithms or decision support tools that generate advice for farmers on, say, chemical use, how can we know if they work if we don't know how they work? Right? And so it's actually also a validity question. Okay. But in the absence of direct evidence, I would say, for the book project, I pivoted and I thought, okay, I'll talk to farmers, which is what I had done during my master's on GMOs in Saskatchewan. I'll interview farmers from across Canada, those using precision technologies, the decision support platforms, and also those choosing not to use. I'll read the license or the legal agreements that farmers signed when they enlist a decision support platform, right? I'll read the legal agreements very closely. I'll look at financial documents, some of which I had to access through Freedom of Information, and I'll try to interview people in the private sector, scientists and insiders, for that, because of trade secrecy law, that proved problematic. So I actually ended up, and for the book I write about this, I ended up going to conventions for technologists, like competitions, data competitions, and that was a really great place for me to learn things. So what I wanted to kind of bring to you today, I don't have that much time, but there's lots of detail in the book, and I'm happy to talk about it in question period or send you a digital copy of the book if you want. But I wanted to just give a kind of very bird's eye view through this table, which I know is a bit text heavy and now has this really silly font, but of some of the uses of farm data, and I'm sure some of them you're absolutely familiar with, but some of them maybe you're not. I wanted to give a kind of typology, a kind of bird's eye view. Also, who's benefiting from the uses, and then what are some of the potential confronting power or power and equity issues raised in the uses. And I won't have time to dial down into examples for all of these, but I thought I'd go through just a few. Oh, and my formatting is not. Okay. Okay, so the first one, it was supposed to be highlighted, is the one at the top. So the most obvious use of farm data, or data collected from farms, including from precision machinery, is that they're used in decision support platforms, right, to feed the machine learning tools that generate advice for farmers on when to seed, when to spray, where to give attention. I'm sure many of you, or some of you, use these tools. And so if we then track across in this table, right, a beneficiary is potentially the farmer. Right? I'm currently actually hopefully about to publish a huge review of the technical literature on whether there are benefits, mostly environmentally, in the journal Nature. So you can watch out for that. Spoiler alert, there's not a lot of data. But we'll set that question aside for now. So potentially the farmer benefits from the use of the decision support tool. Like Climate Field View, for example, right? Maybe they get management advice. They're potentially, through more precise or judicious use of inputs, able to save on input, which is a health benefit, but also a cost benefit. So that's a potential benefit. But at the same time, the company benefits monetarily, right? From the license fees, which the farmer pays the company, Bayer Monsanto in the Climate Field View example. And so that's an important benefit to think about, economic benefit. And in addition, right, the company benefits from the data themselves, which can be, in economic terms, it's called assetized. So it's not really commodified. The data are gathered and can be sold, that's true. But there's all sorts of ways that economic and other kinds of value can be created from the data, especially as it's aggregated across farms. And this is a really important point. Okay, so for example, there's evidence actually from, I think, work that Darren did with ETC Group, that John Deere has transferred data to input supply companies like Monsanto. And we might infer that an agrochemical company would use the data in a variety of ways. I'm just going to give one. Based on historic practice, right, we can make, we don't know, but I think we can make a well-reasoned inference that they could use the big data sets with what's called predictive analytics, right? Sophisticated computing that can mine a huge data set and make predictions about the future, right? I think we can infer that a chemical company could use such a predictive analytics to predict whole regions of farming that might be in need of a particular chemical and then set prices, right? We know that through the good work that NFU has done with those graphs that track, say, commodity prices or input prices with together, right? We know that price setting happens or has happened. And so it's a bit of an inference, but I think it's a well-reasoned one. But it's also the case that when I read the license agreements for these tools, there's evidence that companies are leaving legal room to do just this thing. So here's just one example. In 2019, Climate Field View stated in their privacy policy, this was a privacy policy, sorry, not the license agreement. They stated they would not use personal data collected from farmers or aggregated farm data for the purpose of seed pricing. But in 2023, that's gone. That stipulation is gone from the privacy policy. So, you know, I work very closely at the University of Ottawa because of the kind of work that I do on regulation around technologies with very well-known legal scholars. I'm not going to name him, but he's always in the news. He's a copyright lawyer. And he said to me, yeah, that's like, I think we can infer that that's making legal space for this kind of usage. Okay, so that's just one example. There's also evidence, thank you, that companies could be deriving other sources of value. So I was going to advance a slide. I had the bottom highlighted, which hasn't worked. But so we'll just move now to, because I think this is important. We think about economic gain, but there are other kinds of value, I think, to be derived from farm data. And one is securing relationships between farmers and particular companies, right? And I know this isn't a kind of, I'm not trying to make a critique of those of you who do have an attachment to a particular company, because those relationships are important. Relationships are the foundation of, well, of everything, but certainly of farming. But there are ways that, right, particularly powerful companies lock in farmers to these relationships. And we saw this with biotechnology seed systems, right? How the license agreements prevented farmers from changing management strategies, right? Or tied farmers to particular uses of chemicals matched with particular GM seeds. And something similar, I think, I'm going to argue, I do argue in the book, is happening with data. Okay, so one instance of this is that recommendations from a company's platform, and for this analysis, I actually looked at the tools themselves, and I talked with farmers who were using the tools of what the economist Phil Howard calls the big four, right, the big input supply companies, including Bayer, Monsanto. And if you look at the advice that's generated by the decision support tools by those companies, they seem to only recommend inputs from the same family or ecosystem of companies. So there's a kind of, right, accumulation of wealth that's happening with a particular company from the use of seemingly distinct products. Another instance, and one maybe I thought would be new to this audience, is interoperability. So you probably, for those of you who've used some of the digital tools, know that this is an issue, the lack of interoperability among the digital tools, like sensing tractors, platforms. And you know, this means that once a farmer has uploaded data to the platform, the lack of interoperability between the different company platforms means that a farmer, just like with GM seed systems, can't switch, right? Even if they're granted access to data from another system. And you know, I would argue that this constrains a farmer's ability to choose strategies based on changing needs, but it also, and this is the bigger issue for me in terms of power, locks farmers into a particular relationship with particular platforms, particular companies' inputs, given that issue with recommendations only within the same family of inputs. But I think interestingly, in the sort of big data and AI era, there's an additional, I think, benefit to the companies. And that is, right, the lack of interoperability among platforms allows for a monopolization of control over data that gives an advantage in the AI space. And for this, I'd ask you to think about Alexa and Siri. You know those intelligent assistants, right? Those are basically, Apple and Google have a corner on the market for intelligent assistants. Why? Because they were the ones first out of the gate collecting data from the most, I mean, it wasn't even consumers, but users of Google search, right? For example. And therefore they amassed this data access that allowed them, gave them an advantage, because the way machine learning, which is what's at the backbone of a decision support platform in farming, but also an algorithm like search, the way it works is that the more data it's fed, right, the more, the higher order of specificity and accuracy it can achieve, just mathematically. So those companies, like Deere, for example, right, who have access, I mean, I looked at, actually just last night, more recent statistics. Right, John Deere recently stated in a financial document that I looked at that by the end of this decade, 10% of the firm's revenue will come from digital platform fees alone. And that's not even the other kind of avenues for economic gain. Right? And Deere has access to, I would say, the majority of farmers, right, at least in North America in terms of data. So they've got that additional advantage in the AI space, meaning their decision support platforms will just be all that much better because of the data collected from farmers. Okay, so, but it's about putting power into your hands and empowering, and I didn't want to be a complete downer. So we're going to pivot now. So I did, again, want to say that, farm data absolutely may help farmers. And in fact, there's all sorts of other environmental gains potentially to be had from the uses of big data and analytics in terms of climate mitigation. And these data could be valuable, right, to you, to us, right, in terms of the global attention to the climate crisis. But in the end, I worry that, right, they're giving, right, the way that the data, and it's not the data themselves or the digital tools or the sensing tractors, but it's the legal and social infrastructure around them, just like with GMOs, right? The way that things are currently configured, it's structured to give, I would say, unique and incommensurate, not equitable advantages to companies versus farmers and consumers and citizens. And what worries me here is what we might call, well, the Matthew effect, right? The already powerful becoming even more powerful. And we know the environmental, well, the costs of, right, corporate power on, say, soil, as we saw in that film, which is incredibly important, but also the social costs on farmers. Okay, so that's my concern. And so what can we do to empower or to confront power? One thing is, I think at minimum we need to make sure through advocacy, and this is what I do centrally at the University of Ottawa. Because of my Canada Research Chair position, I actually have some access to decision makers. And for some reason, I've started to become invited into the regulatory space around data and AI. And I'm always the person, I'm going to pledge to you here, but I want you to know that I'm advocating for farmers and for farmers and farm data to be accounted for in new legislation on data and AI. So we have two proposed pieces of legislation, Bill C-27 and ADA. And currently, you probably know, under the current privacy legislation, data legislation, there's nothing bespoke or specific to farmers, protection of farmer privacy, protection of food workers. And so that's one thing that we can do, and that's what I'm trying to do. Yeah. Okay. I think I think there's also, through advocacy, like the kind that the NFU does, and that I'm sure many of you do, and the work that I do, we can advocate and try to put pressure on decision makers in the public sector, but also the private sector. And I started to explore with folks at the University of Guelph who work on competition and anti-competition, the ability to put pressure on the private sector to incorporate different models of what I would call data governance. So not regulation per se, but how, is there a way that a company could pay a farmer for data, right? If data are for sure an asset, in that it's a source, they are a source of economic gain for industry, is there a way that farmers could be paid for data contributions, as one example? Or are there data sharing, better data sharing, more robust data sharing agreements that could be signed that give some of the benefits, economic and otherwise, back to farmers? What about data cooperatives? There are different models, and I point you toward this report that was written via Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, but also through this international development agency called Development Gateway last year. And it looked at case studies where industry has done this, different alternate data governance regimen. Now, this is the global south, so there's a lot less at stake in terms of the economic and the market effectively. But it has been done, and I think we should kind of explore this as a potential realm for advocacy. Okay, I'm finishing up. And then last, there's a couple projects that I'm working on that are really trying to create tools for this kind of advocacy and empowerment at the hands of, at the level of you, the farmer. So one of them is called the ethical, it's not that catchy a title, is it? Ethical Data Governance for Agriculture. project. I'm not leading it. Hannah Whitman at UBC is leading it with the wonderful Sarah Louise Reuter, who just defended her PhD there, and she's going to be coming to Ottawa to work with me in January, and Shauna McKinnon. And one of the things that we've done in this project, I'm a collaborator and I've worked on it, is we've created a toolkit for farmers and for food system workers. So one of the things in the toolkit that I think might interest you is a glossary of terms that Sarah Louise and I are going to continue to develop through another project we have going forward. A glossary of terms that would help you be able to quickly scan one of the legal agreements that we know are almost impossible to read and they take forever to read. And to have a sense, right, of what the legal language, to be able to translate that language into somewhat plain language that would empower you, to read the documents critically. Okay, there's so much more I can say, but I've run out of time. Thank you so much.